Hi, guys. Welcome to our last lecture of the semester. So, today we're going to be talking about climate change and laws on greenhouse gases and kind of how things have changed and evolved and maybe not been so successful in our government on regulating these items. Um, so, this week we have our climate change lecture, your presentations are due this week, and then next week is our final. So crazy that our semester is almost over. Okay, so the big story on climate change and regulation of greenhouse gases and environmental law is how little has actually been done to fix it, regulate it, make laws on it. So the laws that we have, the statutes enacted by Congress are more about studying climate change, reporting emissions, but and assessing the risk, and all of that. But no real, no real sweeping legislation like clean air, clean water, things like that. There are still obligations through our regs and other laws, corporate insecurities, energy, natural resources law, like about, reporting and limiting things, but not with the 100% goal of reducing greenhouse gases and slowing climate change. Some states have done some of this work on their own, but it would be nice if Congress could come up with some sort of legislation on this, but any major attempts in the past has failed. So, environmental people who are concerned about climate change and greenhouse gases have kind of tried every avenue to get some work done on this. So, we really started thinking about this a long time ago, back in 1978, when President Carter created the National Climate Program, which again is a studying, coordinating uh, resources, studying the effects of climate change, things like that. In 1987, under the Reagan administration, the climate, maybe that's a new catchphrase for us, but the Global Climate Protection Act was passed, where scientists were, you know, becoming concerned about CO2 emissions, and the act encouraged a coordinated national policy vis-a-vis climate change, but there were no specifics on how we were going to achieve that. On George Bush 1, the U.S. Global Change Research Act was passed, um, which created this U.S. Global Change Research Program. And then through this, there is a national climate assessment report that is created every 4 years. So the theme is that, yeah, it's discussed, yes, it's studied, but nothing is done. In 1992, the United Nations had a convention regarding climate change, which was called the UNFCCC, three C's, um, and that was ratified under Bush 1. Kyoto Protocol, which is a kind of a global treaty kind of thing, under Clinton was signed by Clinton but not ratified by Congress. And then when George Bush 2 became president, he didn't even submit the Kyoto Protocol to be ratified by Congress. So it's just something that was signed by President Clinton but never really officially adopted by the United States. There were a couple of bills proposed in Congress to control greenhouse emissions and address climate change. So 2003 McCain-Lieberman bill, that one failed. But in that year, the appropriations bill did require that big emitters of CO2 gases have to report them. So that's, I guess, a victory. So then you can see if they're reported, then you maybe see how they need to be lessened or reduced or whatever. And stricter fuel economy standards were imposed. Nancy Pelosi formed a select committee on energy independence and global warming. And then again in 2008, Lieberman Warner was another bill proposing to limit greenhouse gas emissions, and that was proposed and failed. So what happened so that's 2008. So that's kind of like congressional. Well, this is presidential here, but then here's congressional attempts. So congressional attempts were failing. So people who wanted this took to the courts, and they sued the EPA, and saying that basically asking the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, saying that you have a duty to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. So this U.S. Supreme Court did find, and because they had never been like identified as pollutants, these greenhouse gases, CO2, they had never made any regulations on limits or permits or anything like that. So the Supreme Court found that the greenhouse gases were air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and the EPA had to determine whether they would, this is reasonably anticipated to endanger health or welfare. So basically, it was kicked back to the EPA. So EPA said, "Oh, we have discretion whether we're going to regulate carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions." But they really hadn't done anything on it. So yes, they're pollutants, but we have to figure out, the EPA has to figure out whether they're dangerous. And if they're dangerous pollutants, we not only have discretion to limit them, but we have an obligation. So under Obama, had it in his head that he was a green president, and he wanted sweeping congressional legislation regarding climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but he didn't come up with one. There were a couple of he didn't, he's like, well, this is congressional purview. This isn't my job. Congress has to come up with this legislation. So a couple of more statutes came up, were doomed to fail. American Clean Energy and Security Act, titled Waxman-Markey, because they were the proponents of the bill, and passed one house, so the House of Representatives, not the Senate, and the Kerry-Boxer bill, which was never even brought to the Senate because it wasn't going to pass. So Obama was like, told Congress, or thought in his head, Clean Air Act isn't the ideal way to deal with greenhouse gases. We really need a new law, a new act. But he did threaten kind of regulating this stuff through the Clean Air Act as a way to like if you're not going to do it, Congress, I'm going to do it without your permission. So in 2009, the first regs were passed, this greenhouse gas reporting rule. And there is now a national registry for greenhouse gas reporting for all sectors of the economy. And, again, you're just reporting it. We're not limiting it. And then, so before that, there was this advanced notice of public rulemaking, which kind of said, this is what we're going to have to do. And because, it's like, all right, if we limit emissions, then there might be like a butterfly effect to other sectors of the economy. And worried that, it's going to either significantly increase the course of energy, or somehow, because you're limiting one sort of fuel, but another sort of fuel or power or emission is going to be worse for the environment. So because it's not a global strategy. So 2009, remember we talked about that we had that the reporting requirement, but then that Massachusetts versus EPA where they kicked it back to determine whether or not greenhouse gas emissions were endangering the public health or welfare. They said, "Yep, it does." So we're going to start limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So 2010 was the first rule limiting greenhouse gas emissions, called the light duty vehicle rule. So that's for cars, stuff that's really on the road. I don't think it's not like tractor trailers or things, but just our cars, SUVs, um, motorcycles. So the rules started in 2012 and got stricter 4 years later. Okay, in his second term, Obama came up with what is called the Clean Power Plan, which is a plan to regulate emissions from power plants. So power plants are going to be one of our bigger, polluters, and kind of made economic incentives to shift from these CO2 heavy fuels like coal and oil to cleaner energies like wind and solar. Okay, so these final issues were issued in final rules were issued in 2015. A lot of states challenged the Clean Power Plan, the rules under the Clean Power Plan, and all they consolidated all of these states who opposed them into the DC circuit, and they were going to hear the oral arguments. But then Trump was elected, and then the DC circuit deferred their decision, because Trump was going to get rid of the Clean Power Plan anyway. And Trump's EPA replaced the Clean Power Plan with, oh my gosh, it's a tongue twister, with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which is weaker. And that was, like 2019. 2016, under the Obama administration, the United States entered into what's called either the Paris Agreement or the Paris Accord. It was within this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically like a commitment by all the countries in this United Nations Convention to make an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so under Obama, the United States was a party to this agreement. But then in 2017, then President Donald Trump said, we're going to withdraw from Paris Agreement. So it wasn't like you could just say, all right, we're no longer there. There was like a time period. And then so the US withdrew in November of 2020. But then when Biden became president, he immediately rejoined the Paris Agreement. So November, December, January, February, March, April. Wait, December, January. It's like 2-3 months. The United States was not in the Paris Agreement. So Donald Trump, his main issue regarding oil and things was he didn't think we should reduce our use of fossil fuels or reduce our emissions. He thought that we should reduce our dependence on foreign oil, because when you're dependent on foreign oil, political unrest in oil-rich nations becomes our problem, and it's bad, foreign policy. So he rolled back a lot of environmental regulations. Really, he just basically undid everything that Obama did, or his EPA did this. He wanted to have the United States create or increase their own oil reserves. So he approved a couple of pipelines, that Dakota Access and this Keystone XL. He allowed mining in the Minnesota boundary waters. He allowed drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And he didn't really trust the scientists who were saying that, carbon dioxide contributes to climate change, or that climate change itself is going to be really bad in the future. So he was skeptical. of the scientists' beliefs and worries about climate change and extreme weather. Um, so again, that's like presidential action or inaction, whatever you want to call it, who rolled back the climate change initiatives that Obama had and said, like, you know what, we're just going to increase our own oil production. So during this time, um, the greenies, as you call them again, were trying to use the courts because they were unsuccessful with Congress. The administration wasn't cooperative. So they're like, well, let me use the other branch of the government, right? Let's go to the courts. So in Connecticut versus American Electric Power, multiple states sued 5 electric power companies, saying that their greenhouse gas emissions constituted a public nuisance. They didn't want it. They didn't want money. They wanted an injunction. They wanted an agreement by these power companies to reduce their emissions every year for 10 years. But the Supreme Court, when it went to the Supreme Court, said, like, you know what, this isn't really what we do. We can't go back and enforce and watch these power companies for 10 years. It's a political question. It's not a tort law issue. So the policy about power plants, greenhouse gas emissions needs to be resolved by basically the Congress. And then Juliana, I think this was our first test. We had a little essay about Juliana. Juliana is more recent, January 2020. A group of young people, so like from your preteens to 20 somethings, they filed a suit claiming that the United States government as a whole violated their rights by allowing activities, continuing greenhouse gas emissions. And then, what was happening significantly infringed upon their right to life and liberty, like the degradation of the environment, global warming, climate change, all of that stuff is, they claimed it infringed upon their right to life and liberty. And it was appealed a bunch of times. It survived a couple of rounds, but in January of 2020, the Ninth Circuit said it didn't have standings. It really didn't have, because the courts in themselves couldn't take on that burden of, like, they can't force the Congress to do something. They can't enforce environment, be a watchdog of environmental laws forever. So basically saying this is an improper function of the judiciary. So again, the environmentalists tried another branch of the government to help them out, and it didn't work. It did work in Mass versus EPA, because then it kind of kicked the EPA into gear to actually start regulating this stuff. So most recently, environmental law under President Joe Biden. So Joe Biden, if you look on the White House website, climate change and is one of his main points. He has the goal of zero carbon emissions for 2050. He rejoined that Paris Accord right after, in January of 2021. He had his own climate summit in April 2021, which was virtual because of COVID. He attended to the UN's CCC in November 2021. He created this climate control office and task force. And he had a bunch of executive orders, which really did what Trump did to Obama. He rolled back all of Trump's executive orders on environmental policy. So, the first one, January 20th of 2021, his executive order required a review of all agencies' activities during the prior administration for environmental impact and see what they can switch or change or help. And on January 27th, which I posted. Did I post it yet? Oh, well, I'll post it because I haven't done it yet. think it's this one. Yeah, where it's basically saying climate change is at the center of all of our policy, foreign policy, national security. It creates like a task force uh, of kind of all of the heads of the big administrative agencies, right? This what Obama wanted, a government-wide approach to the climate crisis. So, it's not like EPA says to do something, but then the Department of Defense is doing something else. So if you look at this task force, look who's on it: Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, blah, blah, blah. So they all have to work together to prioritize action on climate change in their policy making. So that was that's this January 27th order. Then more recently, we all know about all the forest fires we've had in the past few years. And we know that trees, right? Trees take in carbon dioxide, emit oxygen. So the more trees, right, you're actually like working against these greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an order, to help with deforestation and, wildfire resistance, but also to, get more oxygen and less CO2. So I think it was 1.2 billion trees are going to be planted. And that was, on Earth Day of 2022. I also, where are those ones? Yeah. And I'll post these so you can look at them on your own. But this is just, Alexa search in the past year on cases where climate change is discussed. So, again, that we have to, when you were doing our environmental impact examinations, climate change has to be something that is also considered. EPA. So, it's just very interesting to see the changes because, the agency websites are a product of, the executive branch. So under, Trump, there really wasn't anything about climate change on the EPA website. But now when I go to the EPA website, it's, it's on the front page as one of the key topics, and it's only fourth because they're doing it alphabetically. So they have their own climate change page. Talk about facts, greenhouse gas emissions, and then, what the heck is EPA doing? So here we have a whole page on what the EPA is doing: reducing emissions, measuring emissions. And, internationally partnering is super important because, if we went down to like zero, if, Mexico and Canada weren't doing anything, then or even increasing their greenhouse gas emissions, then it doesn't make a change globally because, there's no border for this stuff, for extreme weather, climate change, all that stuff. So yeah, and there's all our partnering internationally and our things like that. So that is what the EPA is doing. So, as I started with, the best way for this to be handled and addressed is to come up with the equivalent of clean air and clean water regarding CO2 emissions and climate issues. But we see how Congress is, and it's very, very volatile, and uh, it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. You have Manchin, who is a Democrat, but all he cares about is coal in West Virginia. So he's hard to convince to do any of this stuff, and kind of holding the Senate hostage. So EPA does have authority to regulate the emissions through their existing laws under the Clean Air Act. And, they're working hard on this right now. But, if a different party president is elected next time, maybe this will all be rolled back again. And, nothing's going to change. So, court cases kind of have spurred, as we saw in Mass versus EPA, have spurred the EPA to do things, but doesn't really spur action by Congress. So, it's a conundrum. It's a problem. It's an issue, and hopefully we'll figure it out before before we wreck our whole planet. I know, very, very optimistic. So, don't forget to get your agency presentation done, and don't forget to study for the final. I have had a lot of fun teaching you guys this semester, and I hope you had a lot of fun learning about environmental law. That's it. Bye-bye.